The man arrived in a black buggy, drawn by a horse the color of old iron, the creature's breath smoking in the thin November air, and he brought with him a county deputy whose function seemed to be merely to bear witness to the transaction about to unfold, to stand at the edge of the porch with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on some point beyond the homestead where the land flattened away toward the river. Virgil Slade was his name, the tax collector, and he wore a wool frock coat of indeterminate age with tarnished silver buttons, the garment hanging on his frame like something that belonged to a larger man who had somehow contracted into it. And when he stepped down from the buggy, there was a delicacy to his movements, a precise articulation of limbs that seemed almost fastidious. His spectacles were small and round and caught the pale November light, and behind them his eyes held nothing of warmth or humanity, but only a kind of crystalline indifference, the expression of a man who performed his duties as he performed all things, with neither malice nor mercy, but only with the absolute functionality of mechanism. Katja Bremer stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with her twin daughters clinging to her skirt, their small fists gripping the heavy fabric, and she watched this man approach with a sensation that began as confusion and began to modulate into something else, something that gathered in her chest like the slow formation of a bruise. He carried a leather ledger bound in worn leather, and his voice when he spoke was thin and reedy, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere other than his throat, a voice that seemed to issue from the machinery of his being rather than from any organic source. And he presented to her a sheaf of documents that bore the seal of the county embossed in wax, and the signature of the commissioners inscribed in careful cursive, and the careful notation of taxes assessed 3 years past and unpaid through the intervening seasons, and compounding now with penalties and interest into a sum that was entirely beyond her capacity to understand or to dispute. The words were in English, which Katja could read only haltingly, her comprehension of the language still incomplete despite the years she had spent in America, and the figures were rendered in a script that seemed intentionally obscure, designed perhaps to render them incomprehensible to anyone lacking legal training or financial education. And when she looked up from the papers, her daughters were watching her with an intensity that children possess when they sense catastrophe approaching, their small faces solemn and their eyes wide. She said that her husband Friedrich had paid the taxes, that he had the receipt somewhere, that there was some mistake, some error in the books, and her accent thickened as she spoke, the German syllables becoming more pronounced in her distress. And Slade regarded her with an expression of such profound disinterest that it seemed he had already moved beyond this encounter, had already filed her away in whatever mental archive he maintained, and had turned his attention to whatever task lay before him next. He informed her that she had 48 hours to vacate the premises with whatever personal effects she could carry, that the land and all improvements thereon were now the property of the county, though in his estimation it would be transferred to private ownership straight away once the current claims were settled, and the way he said this suggested that the entire proceeding was predetermined, that the conversation between them was merely theater, a performance of legality performed for the benefit of the deputy and the record. He departed in the same carriage in which he had arrived, the deputy trailing behind him with his hat still in his hands, and Katya stood in the doorway, with her daughters pressing against her legs and her mind moving through possibilities like a hand moving through water, sorting and discarding, searching for some purchase, some foothold in the sudden vertical drop that had opened before her. The house had been her sanctuary, and the land had been her inheritance, purchased with Friedrich's labor and his sacrifice, purchased with the money he had earned, working from before dawn until after dusk, through every season, and now it was gone with the same swiftness that wind erases footprints in dust. She had 3 years of careful work in the cellar, in the fermentation crocks and the preserved jars, in the planning and the seed selection and the seasonal labor that had accumulated like layers of stone into the foundations of survival through the winter months ahead. She had Friedrich's grave marked with a wooden cross 2 months old, the paint on the marker still bright white, the pain of his death still fresh in her chest, his horse-riding accident during harvest still vivid in her memory with a clarity that seemed almost malicious. The way the neighbors had brought his body back to the farmhouse with his neck bent at an angle that no living neck should bend, and she had washed him with her own hands and sewn him into the quilting with careful stitches, and it had all felt like something happening to someone else, some other woman, some other tragedy, some other widow, being forced to perform the final offices of love over a corpse. Now this grief was being compounded by displacement, by the necessity of action and decision in a moment when she felt hollowed out and incapable of thought, hollowed out as though her own substance had been removed and only the shell remained, the outer form of a woman persisting, but the interior essence gone. She began to gather what she could, moving through the house with deliberate steps, selecting items by some calculus that combined utility with sentiment, understanding instinctively that everything could not be saved, and so every choice was a choice to abandon something else. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed this kind of work before, who understood the weight of objects and their volume and the way they fit together, and there was in her movements a quality of acceptance, as though she had already surrendered to circumstance and was now simply proceeding with the business of salvaging what could be salvaged. She took the fermentation crock that had belonged to her mother, a large stoneware vessel with a wide mouth and thick glazed sides, a crock that had been used in the Black Forest for 4 generations of Bremer women to preserve cabbage and beets and turnips through the long Bavarian winters, and she wrapped it carefully in quilting to protect it from breaking and secured it to the bottom of her handcart with twine, understanding that this crock was essential, that without it, she would be unable to preserve vegetables in the way that she knew, in the way that her hands had learned. She took the jars of sauerkraut that she had prepared that autumn following her mother's recipe with exact precision, layer by layer of cabbage and salt in the sealed jars, with the weight plates keeping everything submerged beneath the brine, the fermentation now complete, and the cabbage transformed into something that could last for months. And she took the jars of pickled beets, with their deep ruby color still bright and clear, despite the weeks that had passed since she had prepared them, the liquid inside perfectly transparent, and the beets themselves glowing like jewels in the lamplight. And she took the jars of pickled cucumbers with the dill fronds and the thin slices of onion, visible through the glass, the smell of vinegar rising from them, even through the sealed lids. She took a sack of potatoes that she had dug from the patch behind the house, perhaps 300 pounds of them selected for their size and condition, and freedom from blemish and stored in straw in the root cellar that adjoined the main house, a modest space but serviceable, the kind of place where things kept and where the temperature remained stable year-round. And she felt the weight of them as she loaded them into the cart, the weight of months of survival contained in their starchy flesh. She took a sack of turnips with their pale gold skin still firm and tight, and a bag of flour that she had milled herself by trading wheat with the miller in town, and a crock of lard that she had rendered from the pig that Friedrich had raised and slaughtered the previous autumn, and a collection of dried sausages that she had made herself in the German style, curing them with salt and hanging them in the shed where the smoke from the fire had infused them with flavor and made them hard and preserved. The kind of sausages that her father had taught her to make in her childhood, that would keep for months if necessary. She took her mother's kitchen tools, the knife for slicing cabbage with its blade worn smooth from use and sharpened countless times, and the spoon for pressing down the fermenting vegetables as the salt drew out their juices, and the cloth for covering jars to protect them from dust and insects. And she took blankets and a kerosene storm lantern that still had half a gallon of oil in its tank, and matches carefully stored in a tin box with a tight-fitting lid, and a spade with a wooden handle, worn smooth by the hands of previous workers, and a handsaw with a blade still sharp. She took her husband's Bible with his name inscribed in the front in the careful script of the printer in Kansas City, the leather binding cracked with age but still serviceable, and she took the cloth dolls that she had made for Lotten and Greta with her own hands. 2 identical figures with stitched eyes and mouths rendered in thread, one with a blue dress made from the remnants of her wedding cloth that she had woven herself in the months before her marriage to Friedrich, and one with a red dress made from a cast-off petticoat that the neighbor's wife had given her, each doll small enough to fit in a child's hand and precious in a way that had nothing to do with monetary value. Everything else she left, the furniture and the cooking implements, and the accumulated objects of domestic life that had filled the rooms of the house, the parlor chairs and the table and the bedsteads, and she felt no anger at leaving them, only a kind of numbed acceptance, as if these material possessions had already revealed themselves to be illusory, dependent upon forces beyond her control, and therefore unworthy of attachment. She loaded the handcart with methodical precision, securing each item so that nothing shifted or threatened to tumble, and she dressed the twins in every piece of warm clothing that they possessed, layer upon layer of cotton and wool, until they looked like small bundled parcels barely capable of movement. They were 5 years old, dark-haired like their father, with solemn expressions that suggested they understood the gravity of what was occurring, even if they could not have articulated it. Lotte was perhaps half an inch taller than her sister, and had a habit of watching Katya's face to determine the appropriate emotional response to any given situation, while Greta was more independent and more prone to wandering, and therefore more frequently in need of retrieval. Katya gathered them close and walked out of the farmhouse without looking back, and she did not lock the door because locking it seemed somehow meaningless now, the house having already ceased to be hers in any real sense, and she turned toward the river because she remembered that the river ran through this country with a kind of reliability, and that wherever water was, there might be shelter, and there might be possibility. The November afternoon was clear and cold, the sun already angling down toward the horizon, and her breath and the breath of her daughters rose in small clouds before their faces. The land around them was still largely green but drained of vitality, the grass brittle and the scattered trees bare of leaves, and the sky held the kind of light that suggested winter was not some future possibility, but something already present in the air itself, something that had infected the atmosphere with its particular quality of penetrating cold that no amount of clothing could entirely dispel. They walked along the banks of the Solomon River for perhaps 2 miles, the handcart's wheels rolling over the frozen ruts in the track, and it was Lotta who first noticed the structure, a depression in the earth near a small stand of cottonwoods where a previous homesteader had dug deep into the prairie and built something that had partially collapsed into the ground, but whose essential architecture was still evident. Katya approached it slowly, the twins pressed against either side of her, one small hand gripping each of her skirts, and she descended the earthen steps that were still remarkably intact despite the years of weathering and abandonment, and her hand moved across the thick sod walls that had been reinforced with limestone and still held the structural integrity of good construction, still solid and permanent in a way that seemed almost defiant. The timber-framed entrance was half-rotted, the wood gray and soft with age, weathered by exposure to the elements, but the posts that supported it were still sound, still capable of bearing weight, and when she looked up, she could see the domed ceiling of the cellar, the sod packed deep and covered with 2 feet of compacted earth and grass that would provide insulation and protection from the elements above. The air at the bottom of the cellar was cool and still, undisturbed by wind or weather, and it carried the smell of earth and age, and the faint trace of potatoes, as though the cellar retained the memory of its previous use in its very substance. It was a root cellar, unmistakably, the kind of structure that stored vegetables and preserved foods through the winter months, a structure born from necessity and built with knowledge passed down through generations. And Katya whispered the German word for it without conscious intention, Kartoffelkeller, the word escaping her lips like a prayer or an incantation. And in that moment something shifted in her mind, and the despair that had threatened to overwhelm her seemed to recede slightly, replaced by something harder and more focused, something that approached the intensity of purpose. She had grown up in the Black Forest region of Bavaria, where her family kept a cellar much like this one, massive and deep and lined with sod and stone, a cellar where she had spent the cool months of autumn storing the harvest, working beside her mother and her sisters, learning the techniques and the intuitions that made the difference between waste and preservation, between hunger and sufficiency. She knew precisely how such a space functioned and what it required, and how it could be modified to serve as shelter and as storage simultaneously, understood it in her bones and in the structure of her knowledge. The dome design created air pockets that prevented excessive moisture from accumulating on the walls and ceiling, a design that had been developed over centuries of trial and error, and the deep burial kept the temperature stable year-round, warmer in winter than the ambient air on the surface and cooler in summer, and the combination of earth and limestone and the weight of soil overhead meant that the interior remained in that narrow band of temperature that was ideal for preservation and for survival, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. It was, she understood in that moment, the only warm place that might be left to her, the only shelter that she could claim without permission or purchase, the only space that might be transformed into home, and she would make it work because she had no other choice and because she knew how. Over the following weeks, Katya transformed the abandoned root cellar into a lived space that reflected her experience and her knowledge in equal measure. And she accomplished this transformation through a kind of determined labor that had about it something almost ritualistic, as though she were performing the work not merely out of necessity, but out of some deeper understanding that action in the face of displacement could constitute a kind of ownership, a way of inscribing herself upon the landscape that no tax collector could erase. The first task was to replace the rotted timber door with salvage planks that she found in the collapsed cabin of the previous homesteader, a structure that had failed completely and whose walls were beginning to be reclaimed by the earth, but that yielded up material for reuse, and she fitted these planks carefully into the frame and secured them with nails that she collected from various points around the abandoned site, straightening those that had bent and preserving those that remained sound. She swept the floor of packed earth with a branch that she stripped of its twigs and bound with cloth, and she carried water from the river in the kerosene lamp's base, the only vessel she possessed that was watertight enough for the purpose, and used it to settle the dust and dampen the floor. And then she left the floor to dry in the weak November sun that penetrated down the earthen steps, the moisture evaporating slowly over the course of several days. She patched small holes in the sod walls with clay that she gathered from the river bank, kneading it with her hands and pressing it firmly into the gaps, and she examined the limestone reinforcements for damage and found them sound, found them capable of supporting the structure for years or decades yet. On the first night below ground, she lit the kerosene lamp and adjusted the wick to a steady flame, and the amber light fell upon the sod walls and the limestone reinforcements and the domed ceiling above in a way that seemed to reveal rather than conceal, and it seemed to her that she had descended into the earth itself, into some portion of the deep world that had been temporarily hollowed out and revealed for her habitation. The twins lay on blankets on the packed earth floor, their cloth dolls clutched to their chests, and they fell asleep, listening to the absolute silence of the underground, a silence so profound that it seemed to have weight and substance, a silence that was almost tangible. And Katya sat beside them, with one hand resting on each of their backs, and felt the small movements of their breathing, and felt for the first time since Friedrich's death that perhaps she had not been entirely abandoned by fortune, that perhaps there remained in the world some possibility of continuation and endurance, some way of transforming loss into shelter, displacement into home. The real work began when the cold settled in earnest, and she understood that the root cellar would be her family's home through whatever winter lay ahead. And she approached this situation with the methodical knowledge of someone who had prepared food for preservation since childhood, someone who had spent her formative years learning the science and the intuition of storage. She salvaged timber from the ruined cabin to build shelving along all four walls of the root cellar, working methodically in the weeks before the deepest cold arrived, and she constructed these shelves with care and precision, using nails and wooden braces to secure them so that they would support the weight of jars and crocks and sacks of vegetables without sagging or failing, understanding that the weight would be considerable and that any weakness in the structure could result in catastrophic collapse. She created distinct zones within the cellar, understanding through instinct or memory or both that different items required different conditions, that the fermentation of vegetables required different conditions than the storage of roots, that dried goods required protection from moisture, while fresh vegetables sometimes benefited from a degree of moisture in the air. She designated the warmest section near the center of the cellar for her fermentation work, the place where the processes of bacterial action and salt curing and acid development would proceed at the optimal pace, where the fermented goods would develop their flavor and character over weeks and months. Here she positioned her mother's crock and the jars of sauerkraut already begun, and here she prepared to make new fermentations from the cabbage that she found still standing in a patch near the abandoned cabin, frozen and half buried, but not yet irredeemably damaged by the elements. And she brought it down to the cellar in bundles and began the slow work of slicing it with her mother's knife, layer by layer, and layering it with salt in the manner that her mother had taught her, and her grandmother before that, pressing down each layer with the weight plate as she worked, allowing the vegetables to release their own juices, which would then become the brine in which everything preserved itself. The salt was precious, and she used it sparingly, understanding that salt was not infinitely available to her, and that waste was impossible. But she used enough, because she understood that salt was the fundamental principle of preservation, that it was salt which drew out the water, and salt which inhibited the growth of harmful organisms, and salt which transformed raw vegetables into something that could last through the long months of winter and into spring. Against the north wall she created the root storage section, the coolest and most stable space where the temperature remained constant and the humidity never exceeded the level that would encourage rot. And here she arranged potatoes and turnips in careful layers of straw, selecting the largest specimens for suspension from twine near the ceiling, where they would remain slightly cooler and less prone to sprouting, and she organized them so that the smaller specimens remained on the lower shelves where they would be easier to access. The beets she stored similarly in layers with straw between them, and she arranged them so that they would not touch each other and would not touch the sod walls where moisture might cause them to rot and render them useless. Along one section of shelving she hung her dried sausages, arranging them on hooks fashioned from salvaged iron that she had collected from the collapsed cabin, and the sight of them hanging in the lamplight seemed to affirm something about her ability to have brought something of value forward through the catastrophe that had befallen her, seemed to affirm that she possessed knowledge and skills that the world could not take from her. She built a small hearth near the entrance to the cellar, using clay and stone that she gathered from the riverbank, gathering dozens of rocks of suitable size and hauling them back to the cellar site. And she shaped the clay with her hands into bricks that she allowed to dry in the weak November sun, understanding that the clay must cure before it could be exposed to the heat of an actual fire. She constructed a fireplace that could burn wood gathered from the dead cottonwoods that lay scattered around the abandoned site, and she arranged the stones and clay bricks into a structure that could contain the fire safely without allowing the heat to damage the sod walls or ceiling of the cellar. She fashioned a chimney pipe from an old stovepipe that she found in the collapsed cabin, a rusty but serviceable piece that she extended upward through the packed earth ceiling, using clay to seal the opening and prevent smoke from seeping into the living spaces of the cellar. When she lit the first fire in early December and saw the smoke rise through the pipe and dissipate into the Kansas cold above ground, she felt a kind of triumph that was out of proportion to the accomplishment and yet perfectly proportional to what it meant, that she had transformed this abandoned space into something habitable, into something that could sustain life through the months ahead. The warmth from the fire moved through the cellar gradually, spreading outward from the hearth in expanding waves of heat, and the limestone walls seemed to absorb and radiate it, and the packed earth floor retained it, storing the heat like a thermal battery, and the combination of the fire's heat and the earth's natural insulation created a stable temperature that hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to preserve vegetables without causing them to spoil, but warm enough to keep her and her daughters from freezing. She laid down additional straw on the floor around the hearth as insulation between the cold-packed earth and the warmth where they would sleep, and she arranged her blankets in a careful nest, creating a sleeping area distinct from the food storage sections, cordoning off the living space from the pantry through the implicit boundaries created by organization and placement. She hung the kerosene lamp from a hook in the ceiling that she fashioned from salvaged iron, positioning it so that it provided light without creating a fire hazard, and she lit it each evening against the profound darkness of underground, and the flame never wavered, because the air in the cellar was still and undisturbed by wind or movement. In this lamplight, amber and warm and steady, the cellar took on an almost homey quality, the sod walls glowing softly and the limestone reinforcements catching the light in unexpected ways, and she could almost convince herself that this was not exile, but rather a kind of return, a return to the world of her childhood, the world of Bavarian cellars and preserved food and the deep knowledge of her mother, the kind of knowledge that America had not yet driven out of her. And perhaps she had been brought to this place and this moment in order to remember who she was before the necessity of becoming American had begun to overlay her with its rougher edges and harder demands. The work of food preservation continued through December, and Katya moved through the cellar with a growing confidence that bordered on contentment, and she made new fermentations from foraged vegetables and items that she traded for, or bartered for, or occasionally purchased from the sparse supplies available in the small settlements that dot the prairie. She prepared additional jars of pickled beets by the method that her mother had taught her, a method that required exact proportions of vinegar and sugar and spice, cutting the beets into thin slices of uniform thickness, and arranging them in jars with vinegar that she had obtained from the trading post, and sugar that was precious and difficult to obtain, and the spice that gave them their distinctive flavor. And she sealed these jars carefully with wax and cloth, and set them on the shelves where they would cure and develop their flavor over the weeks ahead, the liquid inside slowly penetrating into the vegetable matter and transforming it. She gathered every preserved item she could obtain through trade and barter, dried berries that she obtained from the blacksmith in exchange for sausages, dried apples that came from an itinerant trader who passed through occasionally, preserved plums that she managed to secure at great expense, and she arranged them in an organized fashion so that she could inventory what she had and plan her use of it across the winter months in a way that would prevent her from depleting any particular food too quickly, understanding that scarcity required careful rationing and careful planning. The cellar began to accumulate the smell of fermentation, a distinctive tang that rose from the crocks and jars and permeated the air, a smell that was not unpleasant to Katya, but rather deeply comforting. The smell of work completed and sustenance secured and winter faced with something approaching confidence. The smell of her own efforts made tangible and present. Underneath the fermentation smell lay other scents that layered upon each other like the strata of earth above them. The earthy smell of potatoes stored in straw, a smell that seemed to carry within it the dirt of the fields where they had grown, the dusty smell of turnips, the pungent vinegar tang of the pickled goods, and occasionally the meaty smell of the dried sausages when she opened the jars in which some of them were stored for additional preservation to protect them from insects and damage. These smells together created an olfactory landscape that was entirely distinct from the outside world, a world that existed only in this underground chamber, and Katya found that when she was below ground, surrounded by these smells, and by the sounds of her daughters playing quietly with their cloth dolls, talking to them in whispers and German words, she could almost forget that she had been dispossessed and cast out, could almost believe that she had chosen this life and that it was exactly what she wanted. It was necessary to travel to Elkridge, the nearest town of any size, to purchase additional flour and to obtain candles and matches, and Katya made this journey in early December, with her daughters in the handcart and a collection of her preserved goods that she hoped to trade or sell, understanding that her cash reserves were minimal and that trade would be necessary for survival. The townspeople stared at her as she moved through the main street with her German accent and her old-fashioned dress and her obvious foreignness, and she felt their eyes on her with the quality of judgment that she had come to expect from Americans who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, as though her foreignness was itself a moral failing, as though her inability to shed her origins was evidence of some fundamental inadequacy. Mrs. Constance Murdoch, the postmistress, a stout woman in a gray bonnet with small round spectacles, not unlike those worn by Virgil Slade, informed her in a voice pitched to carry throughout the post office that the German woman was living in a hole with her babies, and she seemed to regard this as evidence of some fundamental failure on Katya's part, some inability to comport herself according to the standards established by civilized society, and her tone suggested that she was sharing this information as a warning, as evidence that Katya had been divinely punished for some transgression. The Reverend Jonas Whitfield, a thin man with a sharp face and eyes that seemed perpetually disappointed with the failings of human nature, shook his head when he saw her and suggested that she should give her daughters to the church so that they might be raised in proper civilization and instructed in proper religion and not allowed to descend further into the degradation that he seemed to believe was her inevitable destination, and his words carried an implication that the cellar was already corrupting the girls, already damaging their prospects for respectable lives. Katya said nothing to these people, understanding that nothing she could say would alter their judgments, understanding that their judgments were already complete and that anything she said would merely be interpreted as further evidence of her unsuitability. And she moved through the town with her head down and her purpose clear, and she sought out the blacksmith, Cyrus Webb, a large, quiet man who worked at his forge with a methodical precision and who did not seem to regard her foreignness with the same mixture of contempt and curiosity that she encountered elsewhere. A man who seemed to evaluate people by the quality of their work rather than their origins. She offered him jars of her pickled beets, showing him the sealed jars and explaining in her careful English that they were made following her mother's recipe, and he examined them carefully with the attention of someone who knew quality, testing the seal and looking at the color and the clarity of the vinegar. And he said that they were the best he had ever tasted, and he traded her iron hooks fashioned for hanging preserved goods and a small grate for the hearth and some nails that would be useful for repairs. And there was in this transaction a kind of respect that she had not received from anyone else in the town, and it was enough. She purchased the flour from the merchant, a bag of approximately 20 pounds, and the candles, a dozen of them made from tallow, charging the purchase against an account that she opened and promised to repay with future preserved goods. and the merchant seemed dubious but accepted the arrangement, and she paid him what cash she had remaining. And she saw Virgil Slade in the street as she was leaving, the tax collector who had dispossessed her, standing outside the bank in his black coat, and he looked at her with an expression of such absolute indifference that she might have been a piece of furniture, or a fence post, or any other inanimate object, his eyes sliding past her without registering her presence, and she realized that he had already moved past her, had already completed his business with her property and the eviction of her family, and had turned his attention to whatever next task occupied his thoughts. Some new widow or farmer whose land he could claim, and she felt a strange kind of relief in this, understanding that she no longer existed for him in any meaningful sense, and that this allowed her a kind of freedom that she would not have possessed had she retained his attention, understanding that invisibility could be a form of protection. The journey back to the root cellar took most of a day, and the twins grew tired halfway through, and Katya had to stop to allow them to rest and to eat some of the dried berries and some bread that she had packed, and she sat with them on the handcart while they recovered their strength. She pushed the handcart through terrain that seemed to grow more desolate as the weeks progressed, as though the landscape itself was being stripped bare by the approaching winter, and the prairie grass began to take on a gray appearance as though the color was being drained out of it, and the sky above held a quality of light that suggested that winter was no longer some future possibility, but something actively present and about to become far more severe, something that could not be negotiated with or delayed. As the afternoon light angled down from the west and the sun moved toward the horizon, beginning its descent into evening, Katya became aware of something in the air, a particular quality to the cold that she recognized from her childhood in Bavaria, a metallic quality to it, a dry, sharp edge that seemed to cut the throat when she breathed, a quality that her father had taught her to recognize as the harbinger of a killing frost, the kind of cold that was not merely uncomfortable, but actively dangerous, the kind of cold that could kill if one was unprepared. She could smell it in the air, a faint smell like metal and distance, could taste it on her tongue, a taste like copper and stone, could feel it in her bones, could feel it in the marrow of her femurs and humerus, and she understood that it was coming not in days, but in hours, that the temperature would drop precipitously as darkness fell, dropping 10 or 15 degrees in as many minutes, and she quickened her pace toward the river, the handcart wheels rolling faster over the frozen ground, the twins sitting upright on the cart and watching her face to see if this pace change signified danger or merely haste. The river appeared before her, its surface beginning to freeze at the edges even as the central current still moved, and she could see the small stand of cottonwoods in the depression that marked the cellar's location, and she pushed the cart down the earthen steps that were now slick with ice, and she gathered the twins close and descended below the surface, below the reach of the killing frost, and she closed the wooden door behind her and secured it against the elements. The warm air of the cellar rose around her like an embrace, and she could feel the stored heat radiating from the earth and stone, and she lit the kerosene lamp and saw the jars and crocks arrayed on their shelves, and she saw the blankets and straw where she and her daughters would sleep that night, safe from the killing frost that was even now descending on the world above. And she felt a kind of triumph and a kind of profound certainty in that moment, understanding that she had transformed a hole in the ground into the only warm place left, understanding that she had built shelter from her knowledge and her labor, and her absolute refusal to surrender to the circumstances that had been forced upon her, understanding that the law and the tax collectors and the judgmental eyes of the townspeople could not follow her below the earth, could not reach her in the warm place that she had made. The killing frost came down, as if the sky itself had hardened into something older than stone, and when the first winds moved across the plains, they carried with them the sound of a world being unmade, a vast and terrible groaning that seemed to press against the very earth where Katya stood at the cellar entrance. Her face turned up to that diminishing light, and her dark braided hair already dusted with the first white flecks that fell, not like snow at all, but like ash, like the residue of all that had lived and breathed now burning away in a cold so absolute that it seemed to contain within it the memory of every winter that had ever been. She had perhaps 2 hours before the full darkness came, before the drifts would begin in earnest, and she moved with the efficiency of a woman who had learned in childhood that the margin between life and death in a blizzard is measured in minutes, in the single human decision to prepare when time still exists. And she gathered the last of the feed for the chickens that she had kept in a small pen behind the cellar, though she knew they would not survive the night, would freeze where they stood with their beaks open, and she drove them into the cellar's entrance chamber, where they would at least have the benefit of the earth's warmth for their final hours. And she brought in 2 full buckets of water from the well, knowing that the rope would freeze solid and drawing water would become impossible for days or weeks, and she carried in a store of wood that she had stacked in bundles outside, though she calculated carefully how much fuel she would actually need, for the cellar required very little heat to maintain its temperature, the earth's own insulation rendering the hearth almost a luxury, a comfort rather than a necessity. And yet it would be this small hearth with its clay walls and iron grate that would mean the difference between living and merely surviving, that would transform the cold, dark space beneath the ground into something that could hold life. The twins watched her move back and forth, Lotta and Greta standing in their small wool dress, identical to one another, as if they had been stamped from the same mold by God's own hand, and they did not cry, though they understood, in the way that children understand such things, that something immense was approaching, and Katya knelt before them and took their faces in her hands, one child in each hand, and spoke to them in German, the language of her mother, saying, "Keine Angst, keine Angst," but there was fear in the cellar, and she would not lie to them about it, so she said instead that they would go down into the earth, into the warm place, the safe place, and they would stay there until the cold wind had finished its screaming, and they would eat good food, the food she had prepared, and they would not die. And Lotta asked her, in the small voice of a child, what would happen to the people in the town, and Katya did not answer, for she did not know, and she did not tell herself pretty lies. The blizzard came fully in the late afternoon, arriving not gradually, but as if a door had opened in the sky, and every wind and every flake of snow and every degree of cold had poured through at once, and Katya pulled the wooden hatch closed over the cellar entrance, and barred it from within, and descended the earthen steps with her daughters, and behind her, the darkness of the world above sealed away into nothing, and the lantern light that hung from the iron hook above the hearth seemed suddenly like the only light that had ever existed, or ever would exist, and it cast the shadow of the hanging dried sausages and the braided onion strings onto the limestone walls in a pattern so intricate it might have been deliberate, might have been intended as some kind of prayer or incantation meant to call down the blessing of the earth itself. The temperature in the cellar was 54 degrees, steady and constant, and within an hour it had become the whole world. the entire universe that Katya and her daughters inhabited, and she moved through it with a kind of meditative clarity, checking the fermentation crocks along the east wall, her hands working with the rhythm of ritual, unscrewing the cloth coverings and examining the brine levels on the sauerkraut, the sour smell rising from the clay vessels like something alive and conscious. And she turned the mass with a wooden paddle, scraping the bottom to ensure even fermentation, to prevent the growth of mold, to do what her mother had taught her and her mother's mother before her. And she checked the rows of pickled beets, the jars lined up like soldiers in formation, each one containing that particular shade of deep magenta that came from the earthiness of the beet and the vinegar's clarity. And she verified that the seals had held, that no air had invaded the preserved space within, and she performed these tasks with the concentration of a priest at an altar, for this was sacred knowledge, this preservation, this defiance of winter, this refusal to allow the season to steal what the summer had given. And the twins sat on the sleeping platform and played with their cloth dolls, dolls that Katya had sewn from scraps of linen and stuffed with dried grass. And they had named them Greta and Lottie, after themselves, and now the dolls performed small domestic ceremonies on the quilted bedding, tending to invisible gardens and preparing invisible meals, and their voices were small and thin in the vast quiet of the cellar, but they were voices still, voices of a life continuing, and Katya listened to them as she worked, and the sound anchored her to something human, to something that might persist. On the first full day of the blizzard, she made potato and sausage stew, heating water in a cast-iron pot suspended above the hearth, and the steam rose through the lantern light, and the smell of the cooking filled the cellar, rich and savory, earthy with potato and bright with the dried sage that she had harvested in September. And she sliced one of the dried sausages that hung from the rafter, dark and hard as wood, and as she cooked it softened and released the fat and the spices it had been packed with in that final autumn, and she added turnip and a handful of the sauerkraut, allowing the vinegar and the fermented cabbage to season the broth, and she tasted it and added a measure of salt, though salt was valuable, and she had calculated carefully how much she could use across the winter, and she called Lotta and Greta to eat, and they sat together on the edge of the sleeping platform, the three of them, and Katya held the tin cup to Greta's lips and let her drink the hot liquid, and then Lotta, and then herself, and the warmth moved down through her body like a benediction, like something that reached down into her very marrow and reminded her that she was alive, that her heart beat, that somewhere in all of this dark earth there was the possibility of continuing. She taught them words as they ate, the German words for everything around them, for they would grow up in a new world, and they would forget the old one unless she gave them the words to hold it. And she pointed to the crocks and said, "Sauerkraut," and the girls repeated it, their mouths shaping the unfamiliar syllables, and she pointed to the jars and said einlegen, the word for pickling, for the immersion of vegetables in brine, the transformation of them into something that would last, and she pointed to the clay vessels and said Gärung, fermentation, the slow work of time and salt, and the invisible creatures that lived in the brine and did the ancient work of preservation without knowing they were doing it. And she told them about the Black Forest, about their Großmutter, their grandmother, who had a cellar in Bavaria that was cool and dark and smelled exactly like this one. And in that cellar, their grandmother had kept the food that fed the family through the winter, and she had taught Katya to do it. And now Katya was teaching them, and the knowledge would pass from hand to hand, across an ocean and across years, carried in the blood and in the hands and in the memory of women who understood the slow work of making winter survivable. The blizzard raged outside with a sound like a living thing, like something hungry that pressed against the earthen roof with terrible patience, and snow accumulated in the upper corners of the cellar entrance, drifting down the steps in fine powder, and Katya rose and stuffed cloth into the gaps to prevent too great an invasion, though she did not fear the cold, for the earth was holding them in its warmth, and the cellar was becoming more comfortable with each day, as the compressed heat of all the living things within it, the slow burning of the hearth, the warmth of 3 human bodies, accumulated and began to infuse the stone and sod, and she felt something like gratitude toward the earth itself, toward the fact of her having dug this hole, having reinforced it, having understood at some deep level that this would be the place where she could survive. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, she had established a rhythm, a system, a way of living that contained within it all the rhythms of the life she had known. And in the morning, she would feed the fire carefully, just enough to heat water for washing, and she would strip the twins and wash them in warm water carried from the pot, wiping the dust and sleep from their small bodies, and she would dress them in clean linen, and it was a ritual of normalcy, of dignity, of refusal to allow the catastrophe above to penetrate into the small world she was constructing below. She made flatbread in a cast-iron skillet held above the flames, the dough that she had mixed from her flour stores, and just enough water, and she cooked it until it was golden and slightly charred at the edges, and she served it with rendered fat and a small portion of the hard cheese that she had traded for. And the twins ate with their hands, grease on their chins and cheeks, and their faces shone in the lantern light like small moons. On the 4th day, something changed in the sound of the wind outside, a kind of easing, though the snow still came, and Katya understood that this was only a temporary diminishment, that the blizzard had many days left in it, many stages to move through before it reached its crescendo and finally, like all things, would begin to die. She had marked the days on a piece of charred wood, 5 scratches for the passing days, and she looked at her marks and did the calculation that every woman who had ever lived through a winter knew by heart, checking her stores against the mathematics of time and need. And she understood that if the blizzard lasted longer than 10 more days, she would need to reduce the rations, to move from abundance to more careful accounting. And yet even with reduced rations, there was enough. There would always be enough, because she had prepared with the knowledge of a woman who had grown up in a climate of scarcity, who had inherited the understanding that winter was not a temporary inconvenience, but the true condition of life, and that plenty must be gathered and preserved against it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. In Elkridge, miles away across the blinding white of the plains, the town was entering into a state of desperate hunger, though Katya did not know this yet, and could not know it, and would not know it until the knock came on her cellar door. The knocking came on the 6th day, a sound so incongruous, so impossible, that Katya stood motionless for a moment, unable to comprehend that anything from the world above could reach into her underground space, and then she understood that someone must have found the cellar, must have made their way across the snow-buried plains, must have seen the entrance posts that rose above the drifts, the markers that she had hammered into the earth to show where the cellar lay. She left the twins playing with their dolls and climbed the earthen steps and pushed at the wooden hatch, and it resisted for a moment, pressed down by accumulated snow, and then it swung open, and the wind and the cold poured down into the warm cellar like water through a broken dam, and she saw the figure on the steps above, half buried in snow, his face frostbitten and his lips cracked, and it took her a moment to recognize Mr. Webb, the blacksmith, the only man in the town who had ever treated her with anything approaching dignity, and she reached up and pulled him down into the cellar, and he stumbled down the steps with the awkward grace of a man half frozen, and she shut the hatch quickly and barred it against the weather. Webb stood shaking in the lantern light, his beard matted with ice, his hands so cold that he could not flex them, and she brought him to the hearth and put a cup of hot broth into his palms, cradling his hands with her own to help him raise it to his lips, and he drank, and then he began to cry, silently, his shoulders shaking, not from cold, but from the relief of warmth, from the understanding that he would not die, not today, not in this moment, and Katya said nothing, for there was nothing to say, and after some time, when Webb had grown warm enough to speak, he told her that the town was starving, that the general store's supplies had lasted only 4 days, that families were melting snow and drinking the water to quiet their bellies, that the Reverend had begun rationing communion wafers and distributing them as food, that children had been sent out to chew on the bark of trees, and that he, Webb, had spent 2 days of the blizzard working on something that he had wanted to bring to her, a grate for her hearth, forged from iron and designed to hold coals evenly, to maximize the heat, and he pulled from his coat a cloth-wrapped bundle and unwrapped it to show her the grate, black iron and perfectly formed, a work of considerable skill and artistry, and he said that he had made it in payment for food, for whatever food she could give him. And Katya looked at the grate and at the man who had made it, and she saw in his face the understanding that she was not going to turn him away, that she was not going to demand payment in excess of what he could give, and something in her expression must have told him this, because he sagged with relief, as if he had been carrying an enormous weight and had suddenly been permitted to set it down. She fitted the grate into the hearth, and immediately it improved the fire's function, drawing heat upward and distributing it more evenly through the cellar space. And she brought Webb a bowl of the potato and sausage stew, and bread, and a portion of pickled beets, and she watched him eat as if his eating was the most important thing that had ever occurred, as if by feeding him she was participating in some sacred transaction, some exchange that went far deeper than commerce or obligation or even kindness, but rather to a level that touched something essential in what it meant to be human, to refuse starvation, to say through the act of feeding that life itself was worth preserving, worth protecting, worth honoring. Webb ate slowly, reverently, as if he could not quite believe the food was real. And when he had finished, he sat by the hearth and talked, telling her stories of the town in the grip of the blizzard, and his voice was low and measured, and she understood that he was processing something, that he was coming to terms with something that had shifted in him, some fundamental understanding of the way the world actually was, as opposed to the way he had thought it to be. And when he finally fell silent and looked at her, there was in his eyes a kind of recognition, a reckoning, as if he had suddenly seen her clearly for the first time, not as the German widow who had been mocked and dispossessed, but as someone possessed of knowledge and capability, and a kind of strength that had nothing to do with physical prowess or the ability to wield authority, but rather existed in the simple and absolute refusal to allow others to perish when it was within her power to prevent it. The cellar, which had been a refuge for 3, became a refuge for many, though Katya did not open the door to everyone, and would not, and there was a limit to how many living bodies could occupy the space before the balance shifted from sanctuary to catastrophe, and she calculated carefully, rationing the water and the food, and she established a system of sleeping hours so that not everyone would be awake and breathing and consuming oxygen at the same time. Though she did not understand the science of air, she only understood from the wisdom that had been passed down that too many people in too small a space would lead to sickness and death, and so she opened the door only when the need was most extreme, only when she looked at the face on the other side and saw that it was a child or a woman or an old person, and she did not let in able-bodied men except for Webb, and when others came asking, she would close the hatch and not answer again. On the 8th day, Mrs. Murdoch arrived, carried by Webb, who had gone back out into the blizzard and returned with the woman nearly unconscious, and Katya recognized her immediately, the wife of the man who ran the general store, the woman who had looked away when Katya walked past her on the street, who had used the tone of pity mixed with contempt that was reserved for those who had fallen below a certain station. And Mrs. Murdoch's eyes were hollow and her hands were trembling, and Katya settled her by the hearth and fed her broth, moving her slowly and carefully from hunger to satiety, understanding that to feed a starving person too much too quickly could be fatal, could cause the stomach to rebel and the body to shut down. And Mrs. Murdoch wept and tried to speak, to apologize perhaps, or to explain, but Katya would not allow it. She simply fed her and gave her water and clean cloth to dry her tears, and by the next morning, Mrs. Murdoch was well enough to sit up and look around at the cellar, at the shelves lined with jars, at the crocks of fermented vegetables, at the braided onions and the hanging sausages, and her face registered something between wonder and shame, and Katya saw her understanding that this woman, who had been treated as less than, who had been dispossessed and mocked, had possessed all along the knowledge and the foresight that had saved them all. 3 families came next, arriving together on the 9th day, parents and children, their faces wind-burned and their eyes the eyes of people who had looked into the void and felt its absolute indifference. And Katya opened the door because the children could not be turned away, and she organized the cellar with the precision of a military commander, designating sleeping areas, establishing rules about the use of the hearth and the water, creating a rationing schedule that would stretch her provisions across the duration of the siege. And the families watched her work and understood that they were in the presence of someone who knew how to keep them alive, and they obeyed her without question. The Reverend's wife came on the 10th day, and she was alone, and she said that the Reverend had remained in town to tend to those who would not or could not leave, and she was trembling with a cold that went beyond the physical, a spiritual cold, a doubt that seemed to have penetrated her very soul. And Katya gave her sauerkraut and bread and spoke to her in a low voice in German, words that the woman could not understand, but the sound of which seemed to calm her, to suggest that there were ways of speaking about suffering that did not require the language of sin or redemption, that did not demand explanation or justification, but only presence, only the simple fact of continuing to live, to eat, to breathe, to move forward into the next day. By the 11th day, the blizzard had begun to ease, the wind dropping to something less than a roar, the snow still falling, but with less violence, with less of a sense of personal vendetta, and Katya understood that the worst of it had passed, that they would begin to be able to open the door, to assess the damage, to move back toward the world of the above. And yet something in her resisted this return, for within the cellar a kind of grace had descended, a temporary suspension of the ordinary rules of human society, a demonstration of what was possible when scarcity was met with knowledge and wisdom rather than with panic, and when the needs of others were recognized as being one's own need. And she knew that when they emerged from the earth, all of this would end. The ordinary world, with its mockery and its contempt, would reassert itself, and these people who had been broken by hunger would begin again to see her as less than, or at the very least would begin to move past the debt they owed her, would start to diminish the enormity of what she had done in the quiet chambers of their own minds. On the 12th day, when the wind had dropped to something almost gentle, a new knock came at the door, and this one was different, tentative and almost apologetic. And when Katya opened the hatch, she saw the figure of Virgil Slade, his black frock coat torn and caked with ice, his spectacles cracked across one lens, his thin face hollow and his eyes wide with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the collapse of his certainty about the world, the dissolution of the understanding that had held him upright. And he stumbled down the steps without waiting to be invited, and Katya watched him with something that might have been pity, and might have been judgment, and might have been some combination of the two that had no name in any language. She did not speak, and neither did he, and she simply reached up into the shelf where she kept the tin cups, and she filled one with the warm potato and sausage stew that she had made that morning, and she handed it to him. And Slade took it with shaking hands and began to drink, and his eyes closed as if he could not bear to look at anything in this moment, could not bear to witness the reality of where he was and what had happened to him. And Katya stood and watched him drink her soup, and she made no comment, offered no words of forgiveness or condemnation, for there was nothing to say. There was only this moment, this absolute and terrible clarity of having taken everything from someone and then standing before them in need. And that was enough. That was the whole story. That was the entirety of what justice could be in a world without institutions to deliver it. In a world where a woman with a cellar full of preserved food and a man with nothing but hunger came face to face in the darkness beneath the earth. And the woman gave the man food, and that was the end of something, though not the beginning of something, for there was nothing to begin. There was only the acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid, and the terrible knowledge that charity and dignity could not unmake theft, could not undo the violence that had been done. And so Slade drank in silence and said nothing, and ate the bread that Katya placed before him. And his hands shook so badly that he spilled some of it into his lap, and no one offered to help him, and no one spoke his name, and he was present in the cellar as a kind of ghost, a man who had passed through something that had stripped away the capacity to pretend, to justify, to claim the shelter of self-righteousness. And he knew without being told that he had trespassed upon a grace that he did not deserve, and could not claim, and would not be granted a second time. The blizzard broke on the 12th day with an almost violent suddenness, the clouds parting and the sun emerging with a brilliance that seemed obscene against the vast white of the snow, and the wind died completely, and the silence of the aftermath was so profound that it seemed to have a weight of its own, seemed to press down upon the world with the force of something decisive and final. And when Katya opened the cellar hatch to the full light of day, the snow that had drifted up the steps began to melt in tiny streams, and she stood with Lotta and Greta on either side of her and looked out at the transformed world, where the boundaries between ground and sky had collapsed into an undifferentiated white, and she knew that she was alive, that her daughters were alive, that everyone in the cellar had survived the worst that the winter could send, and that whatever came next would be another chapter in the same long story of endurance and witness that had brought her across an ocean and into the earth beneath the Kansas plains. The people emerged slowly, one by one, blinking against the light, and they made their way back toward Elkridge, where the town had entered into the shock of survival. The realization that what had seemed like absolute devastation had not in fact been complete, that there were people alive and people who had fed them. And as the news spread through the streets of what Katja Bremer had done, what she had stored, what she had preserved and rationed and given without expectation of return, something shifted in the way the town saw her, though it was a shift that would take time to complete itself, that would never be entirely complete, for people do not easily transform their understanding of anyone. They resist the revelation that they have been wrong, that they have failed in their duty to recognize the worth of another. And so the grateful would turn suspicious, would begin to whisper that she must have known the blizzard would be this severe, must have planned for it with some kind of uncanny knowledge, must have hoarded food that should have been shared before the crisis came, and the whispers would take root in some hearts and grow. Though there would also be those, like Mr. Webb, who understood what they had witnessed, who had seen the cellar and the abundance and the careful system of preservation, and knew that they were looking at something like genius, like a kind of sacred knowledge that had come from somewhere outside the town's understanding. And Webb carried this knowledge with him back to the smithy, and he began to ask questions, to look at the records that Slade had kept, to understand that the land had been seized fraudulently, that the tax assessments that had driven Katja from her homestead were based on falsified documents, and he began to write letters, careful letters to the territorial governor in Topeka, describing what he had witnessed, detailing the pattern of seizures that Slade had engaged in across the county, laying out the evidence in the meticulous hand of a man trained to precision, and the letters found their way into the hands of a federal auditor who was authorized to investigate such matters. And the auditor came in the spring when the mud was thick and the rivers were running high, and he examined the records with the cold precision of a man trained to find fraud. And he uncovered not one theft, but dozens, a systematic campaign of dispossession that had enriched Slade considerably and impoverished many. And Slade was arrested and charged and tried and eventually convicted, and his property was seized to be distributed among those he had defrauded, and Katja's original homestead was returned to her, the land that she had worked and improved and been stolen from, and she received it back not as a gift or as charity, but as the restoration of what had always been hers. Yet she did not abandon the root cellar, and she did not erase the knowledge that she had acquired through that terrible season, and she did not move entirely back into the world above, but rather she established a pattern of living that honored both the summer and the winter, that recognized that the cellar was not a place of exile, but a place of power. And she began to file additional homestead claims on the acreage surrounding the cellar, using provisions in the territorial law that allowed for adjacent claims in certain circumstances, and eventually she held title to a substantial piece of land, and on the upper portion she began to rebuild the house that had been her original homestead, raising the walls slowly with the help of Mr. Webb and others who had come to understand her value. And in the summer she lived in the house and worked the fields and tended a garden where she grew the vegetables that she would preserve and store. And in the autumn she undertook the great work of preservation, filling crocks with sauerkraut, packing jars with pickled vegetables, hanging dried sausages and braided onions from the rafters. And in the winter, she and her daughters descended into the earth and lived as her mother and her mother's mother had lived, in the warm, dark place, in the abundance of the preserved, in the knowledge that hunger would not come, that cold would not penetrate, that whatever the season demanded could be met with the preparations that had been made. Years passed, and Lotta and Greta grew into young women who knew the work of preservation as instinctively as they knew how to breathe. And they worked alongside their mother in the cool darkness of the cellar in the autumn, their hands moving through the familiar motions, their voices speaking German words that their mother had taught them, the words for cabbage and salt and fermentation and brine. And they filled the crocks the same way that their mother had filled them, and their mother's mother had filled them. And the knowledge came through their hands and their bodies, not from instruction, but from repetition, from the simple fact of being present and watching and then doing. And the cellar grew more full with each passing year, the shelves bending under the weight of preserved summer, the air thick with the smell of fermentation and vinegar and dried herbs. And it became something more than a place of survival. It became a kind of sanctuary, a place where the work of women's hands was honored and made visible, where the wisdom of ages was being carried forward into an uncertain future, and where a woman who had been told that she was nothing had built something that would outlast her, that would continue to nourish, that would demonstrate to anyone with eyes, to see that the old ways, the careful ways, the ways of patience and preservation and an abundance born from knowledge would always prevail against the hunger that periodically attempted to reduce the world to chaos and terror. And so the crocks fermented still in the darkness, the sauerkraut transforming itself molecule by molecule, the salt and the brine and the invisible fermentation bacteria doing their quiet work, and the jars of pickled vegetables sat in their orderly rows, and the braided onions hung from the rafters, and the dried sausages darkened with age, and the shelves held the wealth of the previous summer, and the cellar itself, that hole in the earth that had been the site of such profound humiliation, had become instead the symbol of defiance, the place where a woman had said to the world that wanted to erase her that she would not be erased, that she would preserve, that she would continue, that she would teach her daughters to preserve and continue. And the simple act of filling jars with pickled cucumbers and fermented cabbage became an act of resistance against forgetting, against the erasure of women's work, against the notion that the knowledge carried in the hands of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers was somehow less valuable than the knowledge of those who wielded power over documents and property and the machinery of dispossession. And so, year after year, the cellar was filled with the fruits of summer, and year after year it was drawn down through the winter, and year after year it was filled again, and the cycle continued, and the knowledge continued, and the woman who had been mocked for living in a buried root cellar was vindicated not by the town's eventual recognition, though that came and dimmed and sometimes returned again, but by the simple and absolute fact that she had understood something true about winter and hunger and the way that the old ways of preservation could stand against any storm, could provide what was needed when the world above became hostile or indifferent or simply failed in its responsibilities. And the cellar became her legacy and her daughter's legacy, and eventually her granddaughter's legacy, a place where the knowledge of the Black Forest could take root on the Kansas plains, where a Bavarian recipe could outlast governments and wars and the slow dissolution of certainties, and where the simple act of putting up food for winter could be recognized for what it truly was, not a trivial domestic task, but a profound human gesture toward continuity, toward the refusal of entropy, toward the affirmation that what is good and nourishing in one generation can be preserved and passed down and taught to those who come after, and the jars would continue to be sealed, and the crocks would continue to ferment, and the cellar would continue to be warm, patient, and alive in the darkness beneath the earth.